Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. Welcome to our 13th season of Left to Black, and we are honored to have Professor Stephanie Yvette Evans join us today. Professor of Black Women's Studies at Georgia State University, where she has also served as the director of the Institute for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. She's the author of Black Passports, Travel Memoirs as a Tool for Youth Empowerment, 2014, several co-edited volumes, including Black Women in Public Health, Strategies to Name, Locate, and Change Systems of Power, co-edited with Sarita Davis, Leslie Hinston, and Deanna J. Wathington, and that's a new book, 2022. Black Women in Social Justice Education, Legacies and Lessons, co-edited with Andrea Domique and Tanya Mitchell, 2019. Black Women's Mental Health, Balancing Strength and Vulnerability, co-edited with Kanika Bell and Nsenga K. Burton, 2017. There's a theme here. African Americans and Community Engagement in Higher Education, Community Service, Service Learning, and Community-Based Research, co-edited with Colette M. Taylor, Michelle R. Dunlap, and Demon S. Miller, 2019. And these are all books published by our friends up at SUNY Press. And she is joining us today to talk about one of her most recent books, Black Women's Yoga History, Memories of Inner Peace, published in 2021, of course, by our friends, again, at SUNY Press. I purposely use your middle name in my introduction to you, Yvette, which I didn't know was your middle name, because on all of your publications, you're just simply Stephanie Y. Evans, but it's actually Yvette that we first meet in this book. As almost a direct portal to your inner self. It's Yvette who talks to us about what it was like growing up and going to college. We don't find out that Yvette is Professor Stephanie Yvette Evans till a little later in that preface. Talk a little bit about your journey to this book.
Like many African-American women, I am a survivor of several different types of violence, including sexual violence that started in my youth. And so Yvette is my inner girl, my inner child, my inner young lady, young woman, who is definitely a survivor, but someone who I credit as giving me a core, giving me an anchor, giving me a purpose that reminds me what a privilege and an honor it is to think about the meaning of being Black and woman in a long tradition of those who have survived some of the stress and trauma of being a Black woman. While my childhood held a lot of, bad places and bad experiences, it also exposed me to the world. I lived in Germany from the time that I was 7 to 10 and was exposed to a different language, and books became my best friends. So reading and writing was the place that I went to for solace, for meaning, for reflection, and for safety and security. So I start the book with a reflection of how I got to be a bookworm and how I got to be an academic. And I didn't start college until I was 25. So, I know that I've had a long and illustrious career as an academic, and I'm grateful to have just hit, 20 years teaching. But this was a reflection of where I came from, because even before I started college, I was a writer. I was a thinker. I wrote really bad rhyming poetry, but it was meaningful, And so academe is my home. It is who I was meant to be, but it's grounded in that survivor narrative of someone who I hold dear, to remind me what I'm writing for.
You write about going to college as a grown woman, and then going on to graduate school and having some self-doubt, and taking a moment of reflection with your grandmother. And she pulls out, what you reproduce in the book, a letter that you wrote when you were 3 years old. And, as your grandmother says, as you reflect in that section, you could have drawn a picture, you could have done any number of things, but at 3 years old, you knew already that you were a writer. Talk a little bit about, what it means to go into the academy as a Black woman with everything that means, right? And that includes trauma, but also joy, when you're able to make those incredible connections. But talk a little bit about what it means to go into that space with the knowledge that you can write.
Yes. So when we moved from DC to Albuquerque, and I was 3, I distinctly remember being put on a bench and given, a piece of paper, and because I was going to write Graham's, Mary Edmonds, my grandmother. So I sat down and I wrote her a letter. I was writing, and she said, you writ that letter. Yes, you did. You sure did. I don't know what it said, but you writ that letter. And I just remember, I was conveying, what it meant to travel, like I was on an adventure. And so I was, letting her know what that meant. So fast forward to graduate school, my first year in grad school at UMass Amherst Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies. And, I had come in, I was a stellar student at Long Beach, and, I'd gotten the accolades and the award and Phi Beta Kappa, and I worked my way through to graduate school. But that first year, I was just convinced that everyone knew what they were doing. And I was, that imposter syndrome and faking it, and you fake it till you make it. And so I took a train trip from UMass, from Amherst to DC, and I saw my grandmother. And she pulled out that letter and she said, baby, you a writer. Like, I don't know what the rest of those people are doing, but I was not really contemplating quitting, but I felt like quitting. She said, baby, this is who you are. This is what you do. And from that moment, that grasping of that letter, that material culture, I interpreted it as a letter to myself. And since then, I was like, you can't tell me that I don't belong in the academy. This is who I am. This is what I do. And when, and that letter really reminds me that this is something that was gifted to me.
This is a book about Black women in yoga. And I'm sure for many people who come across the title, right, there's a moment of pause, right? Because when we think of yoga, first of all, we don't think about Black people. And we certainly don't think about traditions that come from the Black experience broadly, but Black women specifically, when we think of yoga. One of the claims that you make strongly throughout the book is for us to rethink the relationship of Black women's autobiography and memoir to this thing that we call intellectual history. And in many ways, Black women's thought broadly, again, and Black feminist thought in particular, is often interpreted outside an intellectual history, right? There, of course, have been many great efforts over the last 2 decades, primarily from Black women feminists and historians, right, to write an intellectual history that speaks to the many ways, multiplicity of ways that Black women articulate their voice in the world. Talk about what it meant for you to go back through these memoirs and these autobiographies and to specifically look for the ways in which self-care, and I want to talk about that term in a moment, and yoga, played such an important role in these women being able to survive and do the important, incredible things that they did.
Yes, thank you. So all of my work is grounded in memoir and memoir as intellectual history. And so I became obsessed and collected of once I started reading life narratives, it was truly an inspiration to see all of the different ways that Black women have experienced life and articulated their identity. And as Maya Angelou wrote, I see memoirs as letters to our daughters, like memoirs are mentors. And so I've collected, 500, 600, 700, just created my library of what I call these these voices in my head. And I've learned so much from just observing how Black women have not only lived their lives, but have written their lives. There's so many ideas of women like Fannie Lou Hamer who did not take time to write their life, but from whom we have so much to learn. But my primary source has always been memoir, because again, as a writer, I was intrigued by those who took the time to write their life. So my question in starting this project was, how have Black women elders managed stress? So I was looking at stress management because as someone who was a survivor of trauma, I recognize abuse and abusive environments, and the academy is an abusive environment. And so I began to write about mental health as I was moving to full professor. And I was like, okay, so, I got tenure. This is supposed to be okay, right? And I started to study stress because stress in the academy is normalized. We act like if we're stressed out, we're doing it right. How are you doing? Oh, I've got to create this syllabus, or I've got this grant and I've got all these papers to grade. And oh, okay, well, then you are a true academic, and it's like it's impossible to do good work and be well at the same time. But I was interested in how Black women in and out of the academy managed stress. So I started looking at meditation, music, prayer, yoga, and exercise. And these are the most popular ways that people manage stress in the United States. And this was the American Psychological Association Stress of the Nation report that said after the 2016 election in particular, the stress level spiked in this country, and these were the most popular ways that people manage stress. So I went to look at the stress management strategies and how these were reflected in historical practice. And so I was looking at, meditation and music, and I know you love music so much, that's a way that we are singing, we are dancing. That's a African practice of stress management. But then I found a textual reference to Rosa Parks doing yoga, and there was a collection of 11 of her nieces and nephews who wrote a book called Our Auntie Rosa, and the lessons that were learned. And there was a reference to, Auntie Rosa going to yoga class with us. And I was like, wait a minute, hold on. Excuse me. Rosa Parks. And she used to answer the door in yoga pants. And I was like, wait a minute. So then, of course, I'm nosy. So I went to the Library of Congress. And at that time, there, and I hesitate to say, like, I discovered this, because people are always discovering stuff in the archives. And no, other people had seen it. The archivist collected, so it's important to say that this was not a new discovery. But it was important, and this is what we do as historians, we make meaning. Like, so what did it mean that Rosa Parks was doing yoga with her nieces and nephews? Well, when you looked at the Library of Congress evidence, there's photos of her not only doing yoga, but teaching yoga. Right? So the deaconess, right, of the AME Church, Miss Rosa Parks, in 1974, right after her 60th birthday, was teaching yoga. And it's a beautiful picture of her in the Thunderbolt pose, where she's on her knees on a 1970s era yoga mat. And then you look off to the side and you see there's several women there. One has a really big afro and the other some stacks. So it's authentic. But here's a picture of Rosa Parks doing yoga and teaching yoga. And she was actually quite accomplished, because there's one pose of her in a Thunderbolt pose, but there's another pose where she's in the bow pose, laying on her stomach, and she's got her feet close to her head, right? So she's 60 years old. She lived to be 92, and this is why, because she was not only doing yoga, but she was, that was part of her health activism as well. And so that's when the focus of this project was like, wait a minute, there's a whole history of yoga, because if Rosa Parks, like why and how was Rosa
Yeah.
Parks doing yoga in 1974? So that's where the focus of the book came from, is really trying to unearth Black yoga history. And what I found was spectacular. And in that there were women like Rosa Parks, like the Delaney sisters, who were impacted by Indian yoga. And I must shout out Rupa Singh, Rumya Pucha, and Srina Gandhi, who are Indian women scholars of Indian yoga. And so I'm not asserting that, well, Africans did it first and we need to dismiss, how we do, right? We need to dismiss Indian yoga. First, there's a hashtag cite Black women for a reason. Right. So I try to practice what I preach, just to hashtag cite Indian women and really find out about Indian yoga from the scholars who are actively writing about it. And they were incredibly generous. And so, I learned a lot about the origins of yoga and South Asian yoga, and how it arrived at the in the United States in 1893 with Swami Vivekananda in Chicago at the World Religion Conference. And so there is this trajectory of yoga that has impacted the United States, and African Americans were part of that trajectory. So that's where you get, Rosa Parks, you get the Delaney sisters watching television programs, and they're like, we were just doing exercises. We didn't know that was yoga. So there is a definite strain of African-American participation in yoga. If you look back at Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, look back at Earth, Wind, and Fire, you start to see, you start to see it everywhere. And there's a picture of, Wakanda. How do you fly a plane in Wakanda, in the Black Panther? She is in a yoga pose, right? Through meditation, you fly with your mind. So there's this beautiful tradition of African-American yoga, but I'm also arguing that there's an African tradition of yoga, right? And that I took a yoga certification class, 200 hours from Yusur Ra Hotep, who's out of Chicago, who established or was part of establishing Kemetic yoga. And so you have these scholars who are going to Egypt and looking historically at Egyptian practices, Kemetic practices of yoga. If we're defining yoga as a unity of mind, body, and spirit, you can find that in the Egyptian temples. You can find that in different plow poses or wheel poses that are all over the Egyptian temples. But it's even deeper than that. If you're actually looking at yoga as a practice of well-being, yes, it's in North Africa, but it's also in East Africa. Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, if you look at the references there, the Queen of Sheba and her people bow down to greet the rising and setting sun. That's the sun salutation. I was like, oh, wait a minute now. Hold up, wait a minute, right? And then you have you've got West Africa, Liberians, the Riro people of elasticity. You've got Zulu Nation and the way that we dance and praise and move our bodies. And, it's very purposeful. So there are all over Africa systems of what we call yoga that are outside of and parallel to the Indian tradition. And the one reference that I point to, or the two references that I point to, are Harriet Jacobs, right? Harriet Jacobs wrote in her memoir about meditation. She mentions meditation 3 times. Now, she was enslaved in North Carolina and wrote her memoir in 1861. If Indian yoga didn't get to the shores of America until 1893, that's evidence of the practice. Right. And she also talked about if she was confined to her grandmother's attic for 7 years, she had to physically stretch and move her body daily. She had a daily practice. She was reading the Bible. Her grandmother would let her out in the early morning hours to stretch and strengthen and move her body. When she was preparing to run away, there was a ritual that she had in addition to her walking meditation. So, sorry, you asked a question. So that's what you want, I
No.
could talk about this all day, actually. But I was just so excited to discover the African-American tradition, the intersections between Africans and Indians and African-Americans and Indians, and an additional, this Black tradition. So, we do have this history.
Collectively, Black folks are facing a mental health crisis and a health crisis. And of course, those things are very much, interconnected. And when you specifically talk about your own travels here, and of course, Black women's yoga history, speaks broadly to the experiences of Black women. And I want to talk about that a certain way in a second. But you're also a Black woman who exists in the academy. And, just off the top of my head, thinking about the relatively early deaths of folks like Barbara Christian, June Jordan, and we could go on and on with these examples of premature death and premature health problems for Black women in the academy. This book, even for academics, feels like, and Black academics, feels like an intervention at this moment in time.
It's necessary. So there's a great book by Robert Sapolsky called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And the first year that I started college in 1994, when I was 25, I had a bleeding ulcer, and it was from stress, right? Yes. Okay. So everybody has an ulcer.
That's me too. Yeah.
Right. It is this, and so Sapolsky has studied for 30 years. He's a Stanford neurobiologist. And he studied stress in everything from rats through baboons to humans to elephants. And he basically helps us understand what creates an ulcer. And there's all sorts of different factors that do it. Lots of physiological factors. It's not just psychological. It's what, there's a lot of factors that go into it, a lot of variables, but it helped me understand the duress I was under, the baggage that I was carrying, the stress that I had in trying to do this thing called college without a safety net, without a guidebook, without a toolkit. And how important it was to me, but how I really didn't know what I was doing. My first year in college was at St. John's in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and that was the home of the great books, right? So we read Homer and Aeschylus and did Euclidean math, and read Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, and Herodotus, the histories, where I found there's Africans. Can we talk about the Africans? And they're like, oh, no, this is prehistory. I was, what the hell is prehistory? What's before history but more history? And so, when talking about the academy and stress in the academy, there's so many points of stress. There's the intellectual stress, Arthur Ashe called it intellectual violence, that creates entire systems that try to convince us that we don't belong, right? And so, my first book, this is kind of a follow-up to Black Women in the Ivory Tower, because it's helping us look at people like Anna Julie Cooper, who is an early, kind of one of the foremothers of Black feminist thought, right? What we now call intersectionality. This book helped me look at Anna Julia Cooper as a centenarian. How did she take care of herself to live to be 105 and a half?
Yeah.
She had at 201 T Street, she had in her house in DC, she had a sun porch. And I spoke with her great grandnephews, and they said that, Sis Annie would go out every morning. She had a ritual of meditation and writing. And so I'm starting to unpack the history of not only Black women in higher education, but Black women who had wellness practices that they that kept them alive, right? During the experiences that we've had. There's the life experience, there's the political experience, there is the, academics love to conflate ego with intellect. And so how is it that you don't go mad, right, when you live in your head? Yoga gets you to that balance where you are in the mind, body, and the spirit.
Wow. I was sitting in a coffee shop prepping for our conversation. Your book was on the table. As I'm packing up, a young woman comes up to me, stops me and goes, I saw that book on your table. What are you reading? Is this some of your research? Why, I'm trying to get to this space, and I saw this book and I'm like, it's not my research. I have the honor to get ready to interview the author. And I mentioned this story just to ask, since its publication, and of course, you've been doing this work, outside of the book, for a long time. How has the reaction been to your research around this issue amongst, everyday Black women who don't have a connection to the academy?
That's a great question. It's been a blessing to bless others.
Yeah.
When I first started doing this research, and when I first got permission from the Rosa and Raymond Parks estate to publish the picture, because it was in the Library of Congress, but it was not made public because, there's an interest in making sure that Rosa Parks and her name and her estate are only used in particular ways. So I went through the estate to get permission, as well as the Library of Congress, to publish the pictures. And then once it was out there and everyone was seeing a picture of Rosa Parks doing yoga, it was like, oh my God, Rosa Parks was doing, and Yoga Journal published a picture and did not attribute it to my research. And I was like, hashtag cite Black women. Let's not erase the labor that went into making sure this happened. But when I talk about it publicly, and when that picture was out, it inspired so many people, and particularly Black women who would come up to me and say, thank you, because my grandmama and my auntie and my cousins and them clown me because, you doing that old hoodoo stuff, because there's this conception that yoga and Christianity cannot exist simultaneously, right? And that if you're doing yoga, that you are praying to another God. And they were like, that picture of the deaconess, the AME deaconess, Rosa Parks, teaching in somebody's church yoga, it helped me, not seemed weird to my family, that you doing, and even in the Yoga Journal, did write, and they interviewed me, and we had this wonderful discussion about, they said the perception of yoga is that it's, skinny white women who are co-opting Indian culture. And it's like, this allows us to have a discussion, but it's not just, Black and white and Indian. The word wusa is Native American. Wusa, wusa. That's the Wusa and Etowah Indians of South Carolina, right? And so it helps us really unpack what it is that we're doing in a truly more mindful way.
The book is broken out into 3 sections. One which I would describe as an exploration of self-care. Then a conversation really about the archival, right? You talk about elder writing and Anna Julia Cooper's discussion of regeneration, autobiography, memoirs, intellectual history, and then, this idea of Africana yoga, which I'm going to take the liberty to attach as a form of Afrofuturism in the context of what you're doing with the book. But I want to start with that self-care piece, because, if we go into a bookstore, there are any number, thousands of self-help books, right? And we don't think very seriously about them, right? And how many celebrities, right, were coaxed into branding themselves by writing a self-help book. I'm sure Kanye West has one coming out, God forbid, sometime in the next, 6 or 7 weeks, right? But you're making a distinction here. I see you sipping the tea. Make a distinction of self-care as opposed to self-help, right? Parse a little bit those two very different concepts.
Yes. I have restrained from taking part in certain conversations. Black women has been trending on the Twitter machine several times in this past month, and I've not said a peep because everything ain't for everybody. And
Right.
I'm talking by, for, and about Black women, and that for me, as a practice, is a form of self-care that you don't, everything ain't for everybody, as the philosopher Jill Scott says. You've got to have some sort of discernment and really look at what you're asking for in terms of, what is your North Star?
Yeah.
What are you asking for when you talk about the self? For me, this exploration was absolutely personal because I needed some support and assistance to figure out how better to be myself. And you have to turn to people like Jan Willis, who is a professor here at Agnes Scott in Atlanta, who is a deep thinker. She wrote her memoir, Black, Baptist, and Buddhist. And, so really taking time to learn what it means to have a self. But I focused on self-care particularly because there's a tradition in Black women's public health. Billy Avery, who was a health advocate, and public health activist, created this network of women. And they published the Black Women's Wellness Guide, and that talks about some of the health challenges that Black women have, the traditions that we've got throughout, the experiences that we have throughout all of our life phases. But the whole last third part of that book is called self-care. So this is not a brand. This
Right.
is not something to be marketed. This is a public health practice that Black women are invested in. And so self-care is, it's academic, but it's not only academic. I chose the cover of the book, Annie Lee, one of my favorite artists, and right behind me, you'll see two pictures, right? And the first picture is Blue Monday. They're both self-portraits. The first picture is Blue Monday, which most people know. And it's her when she was working for the railroad and had to get up at, 5:30 in the morning, and she was tired. The second is called My Cup Runneth Over. And that's the cover of the book. They're both Black women with blue backgrounds, with white gowns. And so self-care is really a personal thing. It's a spiritual thing. It is something that you choose. You can't always choose your health status. There's so many mitigating factors, but wellness is a choice. Wellness is something that you choose. And that doesn't mean that you have to do it by yourself or can do it by yourself. But that self-help is intensely personal, but it's also communal. It's not just about yourself. It's not just about, what kind of bubble bath or, spray. It has nothing to do with that at all. I mean, but, it is a journey. It is what choices and decisions you are making for yourself that impact how you communicate with other people.
I'm going to end by taking the conversation in a little bit of a different direction. You in the book, in fact, talking about, Black women's studies, at this 50-year point, right? Both as a field, but also marking yourself, at the time that you were finishing the book. How important of an intervention has Black women's studies been to the broader field of Black studies? And historically, that has been contentious at many different times. But also in terms of, if we think about the original model of Black studies as, a demand that came from the streets to the academy for Black academics and scholars to do work that actually impacts upon the lives of people who are in the streets. You know, our students, notwithstanding, how important of an intervention has Black women's studies been over the last 50 years?
It has been vital for me personally, and it's vital for the future of the academy. There is so much happening with the dynamics of who is going to college, who, and there's a lot of DE&I, initiatives, but we have to look at the academy as an institution, and in the way that Anna Julia Cooper does, right? This concept of regeneration, looking backward, looking inward, and looking forward. We have to look totally at what the academy is and does and what it could be. And Black women's studies, Black studies, women's studies, and Black women's studies, celebrating its 50th anniversary in the same year that I turned 50. So we're kind of coming of age together. It's essential for not only democracy, but it's essential for human rights. If you look at scholars like Carol Anderson, who has been so central in how she picks apart what we call this American project. And if we're talking about higher education, not only in this country, but as a world building, right? A world build, as Mary McLeod soon said, build a better world, right? If the academy is to be an agency, an organization to build a better world, then Black women are at the center of that, right? We are the barometer of justice. We are the barometer of intellect. We are the measure and the means of what it is that you say you want to do if you're being excellent. If you look at Anna Julia Cooper, right, and the legacy that she has, if you look at W.E.B. Du Bois, right, and this concept of disciplinarity, the concept of being able to write poetry and have critical social and political and economic evaluation, and assess a play, and do Afrofuturism, right? Yeah. All of those things have been happening. That we're just commemorating the 50th anniversary of what we have done in our era.
Right.
And it's crucial, it's critical, it's imperative if we're going to say that we are training scholars. I mean, I have one job. My job is to train scholars. That's the one job. And I was department chair for 12 years, and that administrative role really gave me insight into what the academy is. And what it is not always what it says it is. But there are ways that we are to function and operate if we're going to train the whole human being, which is what Du Bois and Cooper both say, that we have to advance human rights. We have to train and honor the whole human in a way that contributes to society, that leaves it better than you found it. And Black women's studies is central to that.
This has been a long overdue conversation. Professor Stephanie Yvette Evans, Professor of Black Women's Studies at Georgia State University, where she's also served as Director of the Institute for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. She has been an off-time collaborator on several projects, all published by the State University of New York Press. But she joined us today to talk about her most recent monograph, Black Women's Yoga History, Memoirs of Inner Peace, published by SUNY Press 2021. Thank you, Stephanie Yvette, for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Neal, for all the work you have done on our behalf.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.